is not like a nut. It's a lot more like a vegetable. It's extremely low in fat. It's got that thin shell, as I'm sure most of you have already been experiencing. The meat comes in one big piece, doesn't break out into lots of small pieces like it would with a pecan or a hickory. But the weird thing is, this guy wants to constantly dry out. It is not going to be stable like pecans or hickories will. When it first comes off the tree, it's at full moisture. If you weigh this chestnut out, half of it by weight is going to be water. And as Mike was describing with the sago, when they're enclosed inside that burr, they're going to not dry out. They'll stay nice and moist. But as soon as they hit the ground like this, then they're going, and they're losing moisture, which is one reason you're going to hear as we cover about harvesting, you got to get these things picked up right away. Because at this stage right now, at that full moisture, this is going to be, well, for one thing, they're going to taste really horrible, like a raw potato. But it's also the best way to store them. When they're at full moisture, these things will keep for like 6 months or more if you keep them very, very, very cold. And that's like at between 30 to 35 degrees. I'm looking at the two. Okay, good, they're not. Okay, cool. All right, but you want to make sure they can breathe. Remember, they're going, and if you suffocate these guys, they will die, and they will start to rot on you. So you cannot store them in a big tote like that. If you put them in that for more than like 2 days, you're gonna get moldy chestnuts. You need to put them in something where they can breathe. You can see that these mesh bags, that works out really well. But if you stack them as deep as these guys are, you're gonna start to have problems because the ones in the back can't breathe. And so one thing Roger has to do when he's got lots of stacks like that, he has to rotate them, bringing the ones from the back towards the front. So you gotta remember, your chestnuts need to breathe, even in a very, very cold environment. They breathe slower, but they still need to breathe. Okay. Can you tell I'm doing this fast? All right. Now, at that full moisture, those guys are alive, and you could actually sprout them for growing trees. Okay? Keep that in mind. At this full moisture, they are susceptible to freezing. Remember when Tom talked about frost and all? 32 degrees won't hurt them. 30 degrees won't hurt them, but if you get that kernel down to 24 degrees, that will kill the nut, and it will start to rot. And one of the ways you can tell that you've got that damage, that it's died, is you're going to see moisture. In fact, here you can see Tom had just pierced the nut, and you can see water starting to come out of the shell. As soon as he peeled off the skin, he could see water underneath the skin. That was a sign that the nut had frozen, and that was going to be a dead nut. Here's a comparison. This guy did not freeze. This one did. Can you see it, people? Yes. Okay, good. Keep that in mind. If you think your nuts maybe froze, start peeling. Take a look. Okay, that was easy to freeze some chestnuts the last few days, you know? Okay. Now, keep in mind, those nuts are wanting to breathe. And as they breathe, they're drying themselves out. If you leave your nuts in a warm environment, they're going to breathe and dry out faster, and this is called curing. Curing is what you want to do to make your chestnuts taste better. When you cure a nut, when you dry it, you're starting to convert the starches to sugars. The warmer the room is, the faster the curing happens. You can cure a chestnut in the refrigerator nice and slow, or you can cure it faster out in a warm environment like this. And how long it takes to cure a chestnut is a matter of the size of the chestnut, how much the air is moving around, and the temperature of the air. Get all that? Yes, okay, good. And the reason you want to cure the chestnut, and you're aiming for yourself to get down to 50 to 75% of that original moisture, or if you're going to weigh the chestnut, it should be 25% lighter. Or an easier way to tell is you can squeeze on the chestnut shell and you'll feel it give, because as it dries out, the kernel is shrinking inside the shell. So as it shrinks, you can now squeeze the chestnut. Instead of it being really rock hard, you're going to feel it give a little bit. And as it cures, you're going to get that good flavor improvement. Oh my gosh. When you cure a chestnut, you can eat it raw, you can cook it, and the best curing is done slowly, like in the refrigerator. The one you're eating now, those were out of our cooler, right? They have been curing since October in our refrigerator, nice and slow. In fact, they almost overcured. They were almost too dry. Okay, and as I said, nut fairies. Okay, when you've got that cured chestnut, you've lost some of the moisture, you've converted the starches to sugar, you could now freeze that chestnut. If you want to store them, it is absolutely fine to freeze them in this condition. In fact, you can take a cured chestnut that is frozen hard out of the freezer and you could eat it and you won't break your teeth. It's not frozen really, really hard. It's chewable. It's kind of cool. They're easy to use. So once it's cured, you could go ahead and store it in your freezer. And that's important to know because once a chestnut is cured, it's not going to be very stable at room temperature. It will start to rot within like 3 to 4 days. They'll keep in your refrigerator 1 to 3 weeks, but in the cured state, they're not going to last very long. So if you're going to keep them for more than a month, yeah, keep them at full moisture. If you want to eat them, though, you got to cure them a little bit so they taste good. Oh, can you tell this is a little complicated? Yeah, thank you, woman. Okay, all right. Now, if you still leave them a little bit more, they're going to keep drying. In fact, you leave those chestnuts at room temperature long enough, they will dry themselves down till they're like shelled corn. They are rock hard. You can drop them on a table and it's like dropping marbles. You try to bite in these things and you will break your teeth. These things are hard. And that's what you call the dried chestnut. But that's got its own cool properties because these things you can store, like shelled corn, at room temperature forever. I mean, nothing's going to happen to them. They won't rot. They're not going to spoil. But you have to have them down to that like 25% of the original moisture. It's really cool. And okay, so you remember how the chestnut was half water? So now your chestnut is weighing half of what it originally did because you've lost all the water. Whoa. Okay, now from this, you could rehydrate them, soak them in water, and they will get soft again for you to use. But it's still going to be a little bit tough. Or you can just store them like that for delicious survival food that you're going to enjoy eating. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Go back. Okay. And if you dry them a little bit more, so you're down to that 15% or less, you can actually grind those dried chestnuts into the flour. And that was the food for peasants in Italy and Europe for hundreds and thousands of years because chestnuts are what people ate all over the world, and they would dry them to that rock hard consistency and they would eat them in the dried state and as flour. And this stuff is really, really, really good. Okay. We don't need to actually do all the work to get to this now for marketing. Tom and I used to do that at one point, and it's extremely expensive to actually make flour because now if you started out with 10 pounds of chestnuts, by the time you get down here, you're at like 1 to 2 pounds of flour when you start it with 10 pounds of chestnuts. So you can see, and you got a lot of labor involved in making this. That's why chestnut flour is so expensive. Okay, that was the simple version. And if you're going to feed it to pigs or chickens, poor people if you do that, this is the proper place to do it with those really, really dried up chestnuts, and you can leave them in the shell. Okay, and we went too fast again. All right, so you're going to always, when you've got your own chestnuts, you need to look at the chestnuts to judge quality. Your chestnuts, when they're wholesome, are going to be glossy like this. These guys are at full moisture. They got that lovely sheen to them. Your customers will look at that and go, ooh, yeah, that looks good. When you peel them, they should be nice and bright yellow. We actually kind of call it the squirrel brain look because it's about the size of a squirrel brain. It's convoluted like that. You can tell these are Chinese. Yeah, okay, because they're not convoluted. It's easy to get the skin off. There's a cooked one. And you can see nice whole color inside. If you saw black spots in there or on the outside here, don't eat that chestnut. It is not going to be very good. Another sign of a bad chestnut, if you got mold, okay, never eat mold. It's not a good idea. And again, mold on here. I have helped some people judge if their chestnuts were bad or not because it looked like there was a little bit of black on the inside and we weren't quite sure. So I would taste them for this gentleman and I would spit them back out and say, no, that wasn't good. That wasn't good. I got food poisoning the next day from that many. Yeah. So just don't eat it. Make sure it's beautiful looking like that inside. And that's a sensitive clicker. Okay. Another thing not to worry about, if you've got a little bit of mold on the hilum, thank you, right there, don't worry about it. It happens. You've probably got a fine chestnut inside. But if you've got mold on the skin down this way, there's a good chance your nut has gone bad inside. This is an example of going bad on the inside. All right. We recommend that if you're going to cut open your chestnut, that you do, did I skip? Yeah, I did. Okay. That you do the simple cut across the belly like this. And I'm glad to see the Missouri Agroforestry Center is now promoting that cut as well, because when you're cooking your chestnut, it will actually open up like that as the chestnut is cooking, and it's easy to squeeze on either side for easy opening. Oh, jeez. Can you go ahead and thank you? And I'm going to go forward. Okay. The traditional cut is to make an X. A lot of people love that, and the cut down this way. I don't know why they do that. This is the easiest cut. It's easy to do without cutting your fingers off, and like I said, it makes a nice clamshell opening up for you to use. However, you don't have to always cut open the chestnut. You only need to cut up a chestnut like this if you're going to cook it hot and fast. If this sort of cut, any kind of piercing of the skin, lets the steam escape while you're cooking a chestnut. If you're microwaving it, if you're putting it in the oven at 400 degrees for 10 minutes, there's going to be a lot of steam build up inside that shell, and it's going to, poof, it explodes. Let me tell you, that's a big mess, be it in your microwave, in your oven. Oh my gosh, I've heard one person say it exploded all over the free world. It's just a big mess. But if you do a slow cook method, you don't have to cut the chestnut. This is how street vendors in parts of Asia will do it. It's a cool black pebble, constantly stirring. They'll sell it to the customers, not cut, and they hand out these little cool doohickeys that help you break the crisp shell and pick out your chestnuts. You may have noticed the chestnuts you ate today were not cut. That's because we use the boiling method, which we are now very excited about, because Tom and I often over dry our chestnuts when we're curing them. And if you try to microwave or oven roast an over-cured or over-dried chestnut, you get this really hard and blackened thing that's not very pleasant. Whereas when we boil them, you end up rehydrating the chestnut a little bit. And did you guys like those chestnuts? Okay, cool. So, and you can fluctuate on how long you boil them. You can put them into cold water. You can put them into boiling water. What I ended up doing with the last 2 batches is the water was already boiling, and we let them boil for about 15 minutes. Tom likes a raw chestnut, which is why we also had the bowls of raw chestnuts out there. So if I'm feeding people raw ones, I prefer to boil them 5 minutes, because that way the shell and the skin come off really easily. Okay. Now, another way you can roast them without cutting is the slow roast, which is about 240 degrees for 1 hour. Again, this is for a chestnut that's only cured like 2 or 3 or 4 days. So it's still got a fair amount of moisture. If we had done that with these chestnuts, you guys would have had blackened husks, because we actually did it, and they never turned out very good. So boiling works well. Traditional, many people get excited about roasting over the open fire. You do want to cut them this way unless you're outside. And in fact, our Bosnian customers mostly roast their chestnuts outside over an open fire because they don't cut them. And so they know they're going to explode. And the tradition among the American colonists is once you heard 2 of your chestnuts explode, you know they're done. And how many of you remember a Christmas song where it mentions the chestnuts go pop, pop, pop? Yeah, oh, I got to learn that song better. Okay, well, anyway, so you can roast. If you're going to roast and not cut, you need to do it outside, because otherwise you have a big mess. All right. Street vendors, you can see these are all cut chestnuts, but that's how they sell them. And it's cool if you Google street vendors' chestnuts. You get pictures from all over the world. Hungary, Italy, France, Singapore, Australia. It's cool. Yeah. Okay. So once your chestnut's cooked, you can cut it up for lots of recipes. You can puree it. And this means basically taking your cooked chestnuts, putting it in a food processor with either cream, sugary water, or chicken stock, depending if you want a sweet or a savory puree. God, this stuff is good. And there's thousands and thousands of other recipes, as Mike referred to. And in fact, the Missouri Agroforestry Center has an excellent resources for recipes, and I strongly recommend the chestnut humus. That's a really good one for potlucks. And that's it for me, and I'll take 5 minutes of questions. Ha! Am I fast or what?
Yeah, I'd say 5, 10 minutes.
Any questions? Yes, sir. And this is your last question of the day, too, by the way. I said this is your last question, because. Go ahead.
If I pick up chestnuts on the ground, what do I need to do to make them viable as a good product in February or March to have someone taste the chestnut?
The best thing for you to do to keep your chestnuts wholesome till February, like what we did, is keep them in a ventilated bag so they can breathe, and keep them in a very, very cold environment, and that's around 30 to 35 degrees is the best. Go ahead. Because they were these chestnuts were in refrigeration all that time in a fairly ventilated place, they did the slow cure. So when we took them out of the cooler, they were already cured. We did not have to do it at room temperature. Hold on. Any other questions? Yes. How are we managing moisture? We're not really. We're controlling how much moisture they lose by how cold we keep them. If we kept them at room temperature, they'd lose the moisture really fast. We do not have a humidifier in our cooler. It's regular temperature. We have even a fan moving things around. So those things are just constantly slowly drying, but slowly drying since they're in the walk-in cooler and it's like at 30, 35 degrees. These are good questions. And way in the back? Is there much research done on value added? Wow, yes. And people who cannot sell their chestnuts in shell, like the people up in Michigan who have colossals, are into value added, where they'll like slice their colossals up into little slices and dry them and call them chips. And they're selling a lot of chestnut flour, and they're making it into pancake mix because they can't sell them in shell. Here in Iowa, because we grow good tasting Chinese chestnuts, we can barely meet the demand for in-shell chestnuts, so we don't have to do any value marketing. And like I said with that chestnut flour, it's a lot of work, and you lose so much value because you're having to dry the chestnuts and you're taking off the shell, that it becomes a very expensive product. When I sell my customers a fresh chestnut, half that weight that they're paying for is water. When I take my chestnuts to Roger to sell, he's buying a lot of water from me. I love that. Okay? So you want to keep your chestnuts as moist as possible so the customers are getting a very fresh product and you're selling a lot of water. Yeah.
I've heard a couple times that 24 degrees is kind of the magic number. When the nut reaches that inside there, it starts to go bad. So in northern Iowa, where I come from, I guess I'm not sure what kind of insulation does it have. I mean, if it hits 24 degrees on the thermometer, I can't believe it instantaneously. Is that how long does it glow 24 degrees? Any idea on how that works out? You talk about a nut on the ground? Yeah.
If the nut gets buried by a squirrel, even an inch deep, it's never going to get down to 24. Even in northern Iowa, even when it's 40 below zero, the ground will keep that nut warm enough so that it will survive. If it's laying right on the surface, if the temperature gets down to 24 Fahrenheit, even for a few minutes, it's dead.
We actually had a scare because we were afraid during this cold spell that some of our seed nuts had gotten down to 24 degrees. And it looked like we had maybe lost our entire seed crop. That was scary because a lot of you had bought those trees already. So we were carefully examining quite a few chestnuts looking for that moisture problem. And we were like, whew, okay. Oh, no, him in the back.
You mentioned briefly that slow curing ends up tasting better than fast curing. Is that difference strong enough to actually create market demand for one or the other, or actual people have preferences for that?
Does it really make a taste difference if you fast versus slow cure? And I would say yes. Because I'm not crazy about chestnuts. To me, they're not a cashew, they're not a pecan, they're not a hickory. But when I eat these guys that have slow cured, I'm like, oh, that was pretty good. And I'll eat a couple more of them, and 3. When I get them at the beginning of the season, when we only have fast cured chestnuts, they're a lot less tasteless. So yeah, I would say there is a definite flavor difference. And it's probably going to be noticeable to quite a few people if they have sensitive taste buds. Other people be like, it still tastes like a baked potato to me. Yeah. Okay. And there was, oh, yes, okay.
Is there a way to measure the moisture level in those?
The main way to measure the moisture level and the moisture change is by weight. By weight, which means you have to weigh the nut before you start drying it and then afterwards. But if you want to do this in mass quantity, you would probably sort your chestnuts by size and then weigh all of those and then weigh them again every 1 or 2 days. And when you see that you're down to have lost about 25% of the weight, you know you got them all cured on average. Yep. I was thinking about that earlier today.
Do you sell them in the cured state?
Remember, I'm trying to sell you water. So we sell full moisture, but we will try and advise our customers that you want to cure them. The Bosnian customers, who are our biggest customer, buying thousands of pounds, they generally don't cure. But I think what has happened is in their storage practices, which is usually at room temperature, it just naturally cures before they get to the roasting stage. So even though they don't intend to cure, they actually are eating a cured chestnut because their favorite size is medium, which cures pretty fast. And I think I'm almost out of time. Okay, we're getting into harvesting.
Actually, we have